Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Sunday, 13 October 2024. When I was a child, I read a lot of science fiction, and I was particularly fascinated by works of science fiction that depicted the end of the world. I read about the immediate aftermath of civilizational collapse, nuclear war in the case of Pat Frank's Alas, Babylon, a plague in The Stand, and a commentary impact in Lucifer's Hammer. And I read about the future after a collapse had already receded into the past, as in Lee Brackett's The Long Tomorrow, Clifford Simak's A Heritage of Stars, Andre Norton's No Night Without Stars, and Poul Anderson's The Vault of the Ages. Heinlein's Farnham's Freehold managed to combine both the immediate aftermath and the distant future into one story. And I saw The Road Warrior during its initial theatrical release at the Liberty Theater in Astoria, Oregon. The greatest of all science fiction novels, A Canticle for Leibowitz, is a post-apocalyptic story, but at the same time, it's an exercise in cyclical history. The story is constructed around 3 episodes, each 600 years apart, with the first episode occurring hundreds of years after a nuclear war, called The Flame Deluge in the book. At the end of the book, we find the world engaged in another nuclear war. But the cyclicality of the world of A Canticle for Leibowitz is balanced by the continuity of the institution of the church. Throughout it all, it's a community of monks who witness the rise and fall and rise again of civilization. Though I no longer read science fiction, I haven't entirely given up on the end of the world genre, sometimes known as collapse porn, as last year I listened to James Kunstler's World Made by Hand. And there are also nonfiction entries in the genre like The Knowledge, How to Rebuild Our World from Scratch by Lewis Dartnell, and The Disaster Diaries, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Apocalypse by Sam Sheridan, both of which I listened to in recent years. All of these books are, in a sense, thought experiments in how the world could end. I just talked about thought experiments in my episode From Augustine to Machiavelli, in which I suggested that the ellipsis in philosophy of history during the Middle Ages might be filled by imaginative reconstructions of books that were never written. So I believe that thought experiments have their place in philosophical methodology, but thought experiments combined with actual events would be more powerful than thought experiments alone. Imagine if these works of collapse porn were confronted with actual circumstances of a collapsed civilization. Imagine, that is, that the thought experiment is confronted with an actual experiment, with the actual processes of history as a civilization, the scope and scale of our industrialized civilization fails catastrophically. Given the truism that nothing lasts forever, despite the apparent stability and the massive weight of inertia behind our civilization today, it will, like all sublunary things, eventually pass into history and disappear. When it does, it will do so by particular mechanisms and in a particular sequence. I've often said that complex systems fail in complex ways, and that means that there are many pathways to failure for our current civilization, some of which may resemble the thought experiments of end of the world novels, and some of which may be utterly unexpected, things that we cannot now imagine. When the eventual collapse of our current iteration of our civilization occurs, and it is a matter of when, not if, significant libraries will survive this collapse, not least due to the sheer number of books that have been printed. There was no similar literary buffer for earlier civilizational transitions before widespread printing and literacy. What books survived the catastrophic collapse of the Western Roman Empire were copied by hand at great time and great expense. In a recent newsletter, I discussed Thomas Cahill's well-known book, How the Irish Saved Civilization, which was in part about this process of scholars fleeing to the relative stability of Ireland when the rest of the world was collapsing, studying and copying books there, and eventually Irish monasteries expanding back to the continent. This is a double movement of idea diffusion in which books left continental Europe and were then reintroduced hundreds of years later. But with the invention of the printing press, books became widely available and relatively cheap, whereas they were formerly a luxury item. Many libraries have been assembled, far more than the ancient world ever saw. And while a catastrophic end of our civilization will result in a catastrophic loss of both books and literacy, a great many more books will survive than in the previous failures of civilization. With these libraries at their disposal, the survivors, our descendants, will have a chance to confront our thought experiments in the end of the world with their actual experiences of the end of the world. So how will our imagined scenarios fare in their eyes? I suspect that they will be amused both by our prescience and by our blindness, depending on how exactly the collapse actually unfolds. We have something of a parallel to this in the many works of futurism from the late 19th and early 20th century. I'm thinking of books like Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, William Morris's News from Nowhere, and films like Metropolis, early attempts to imagine the future. When we read these books and watch the films, they seem mostly comical, while occasionally insightful. Mostly, they were incapable of conceptualizing the future that is our present, but every once in a while they got it right, and their moments of accuracy resonate with us. We recognize ourselves in them. I suspect those who witnessed the actual collapse of industrial civilization will also view our efforts to foresee this event with a mixture of dismissive laughter, punctuated by moments of surprised recognition. Those who lived through the collapse will have little leisure, being mostly concerned with mere survival. But there will be a few who carry mass market paperbacks in their backpacks, just as Christopher McCandless carried novels in his backpack, and they will read passages aloud around the campfire at night for the entertainment of fellow survivors. We can imagine them camped in a burned out basement, reading a page from Alas, Babylon or On the Beach and laughing, whether because it's so wrong or because it's so right. Gallows humor will be the order of the day, and nothing will be off limits. With nothing left to lose, why would they care what anyone had to say or what anyone thought? Those who live later, in the aftermath of the collapse, after some novel paradigm of order has been established, will have more leisure to read. But by that time, new attitudes will have become established, and new social mores will have constrained the range of acceptable interpretations. The ancient literature of our contemporary world will be boxed into a conventional interpretation that serves the needs and the expectations of this future society, not the needs and expectations of our society, by them long dead and gone. Thought will not be as free for them as it will be for those hardy souls who lived through the collapse, who see the old order swept away, and with it all of its presuppositions and self-imposed limitations before any new cognitive regime arises to replace the old. It will be out of that freedom of disorder that the new world will be born. Every contemptuous guffaw and every shocked moment of recognition when they see themselves in what we once imagined will be reflected in a kaleidoscope of new experiences, which will accrue much more rapidly than they can be understood. It's only later, in reflection, and when leisure is possible, that the sense-making function of the human mind will slowly work its way through what's happened and declare ex post facto the definitive meaning of it all. But the crucial breakthroughs that define the new and unknown world of the future will be made in the chaos of survival and scraping by under the most difficult conditions. The selection pressures of this harsh environment will winnow away anything unnecessary and will prize only that which is distinctively representative of the changed circumstances of the survivors and their world. If they have any use for us at all, it will only be a use viewed through the spectacles of experiences we cannot imagine. For my part, I hope that copies of Augustine's City of God and Ibn Khaldun's Macadamah and some more recent works of philosophy of history that I have discussed here survive, as indeed Augustine's work survived the collapse of the Roman Empire, and Ibn Khaldun's work survived the end of the Islamic Golden Age, and both are read today by we who populate a radically different civilization than that of the authors. Philosophy of history is perennial in this way, that the attempt to understand history, even when it falls short, will always be of interest, especially since those who follow us will have experienced more history than we have experienced, and will look back on a longer and more comprehensive past than we do. They will have more on their plate than we do, and even we have too much on our plate to understand. So we're related to our future descendants as men engaged in the same project of understanding. I read Augustine and Ibn Khaldun, and they will read Augustine and Ibn Khaldun, and perhaps a few more classics added to the canon in the meantime. And through our joint efforts over the longue durée, and separated by distinct civilizations, we will, as it were, greet each other across the ages, and that will be our shock of recognition over time to see others like ourselves, both in the past and the future, engaged in a common enterprise. We may even come to see the rise and fall of civilizations as ultimately serving the interest of philosophy of history by testing civilizations in extremis and providing us with the opportunity to compare our thought experiments with actual experience, and so advancing our knowledge. Thanks for listening.